Let's begin at the beginning, maybe even before the beginning you know. The genesis of the Twilight Zone wasn't its first episode, Where Is Everybody? It was a teleplay Rod Serling wrote for the Westinghouse Desilu Playhouse called The Time Element in 1958. To set the scene, Rod Serling had by this point been writing for TV and radio for a few years and had begun to establish quite a name for himself. He had had big breakthroughs with the TV plays Patterns and Requiem for a Heavyweight, and he had even won 3 Emmys, which is no small feat. But he was wanting an opportunity to create his own show, one that would allow him greater creative control. The Time Element had been written as a proposed pilot for just such a series, and despite being purchased, it had been shelved and not produced until CBS producer Burt Granite found the script in storage and decided to present it as part of the Desilu Playhouse, a weekly anthology series produced by Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz after I Love Lucy had ended. Presented by Desilu Playhouse in 1958, the Time Element was introduced by Desi Arnaz in the role that would later be filled so memorably by Rod Serling. The reaction to this teleplay was so great and so positive that it led to the Serling-Helm series, The Twilight Zone, as we know it, being commissioned. This was apparently Rod Serling's first science fiction story. Not that you can tell, because it's as accomplished a piece of storytelling as anything we might expect from The Twilight Zone. The plot. A small-time gambler, Pete Jenson, is consulting a psychiatrist about a recurring dream that is troubling him to the point where he questions his sanity. In his dream, the protagonist finds himself 17 years in the past in Honolulu on the day before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, knowing what's about to happen and not sure if he can convince anyone else of what he knows in order to save their lives. But more than a dream, Jenson believes he is actually going back in time to this fateful day. Is it just a dream? Is Jenson mentally unstable, or is he really traveling in time? Now, no spoilers to the ending of this one, as I know it's not as well known as most Twilight Zone episodes, and I don't want to ruin it if you haven't seen it already. What's interesting about this teleplay? Well, it's got fabulous titles in the same style as the Twilight Zone would go on to adopt. Desi Arnaz, while a charismatic screen presence in his own right, I think lacks the dramatic intensity of Serling as a host, and his introduction is in a much more basic style than the often poetic introductions the Twilight Zone was renowned for. The voiceover that starts the story itself, however, is total Rod Serling in style, read by a voiceover artist who also, I think, is not as effective dramatically as Serling would be in this role. But the essence is there in the concise and intriguing intro. The main character, Pete Jenson, a kind of small-time gambler, is another of Serling's not quite successful everymen, the same type that regularly populates the Twilight Zone. Psychologically incisive dialogue sets an uneasy tone right from the start, along with the show's theme of a man questioning his sanity. It's a story with a strong interest in psychology and takes place in a psychiatrist's office. As a side note, have you ever noticed how strong the preoccupation with mental illness and the stigma of going crazy is in shows of this period? Back when the idea of mental illness was conceptualized in polar terms of people either being normal or crazy. Of course, the idea of insanity at this point seems heavily stigmatized. I've often wondered if this is connected to the generation of men who so often feature in these dramas, men of an age to have served in World War II. A fear of and fascination with the idea of psychiatry seems very much a hot-button issue of this time. And have you ever wondered whether the multitudes of people who would have been suffering from active PTSD as a result of their war service were at the heart of this preoccupation? I guess this would have been one of the great undiscussed issues of the post-war period, something many suffered from but were afraid to discuss openly. Interestingly, this episode does feature characters referring to their war experiences in the context of talking about problem drinking. It acknowledges the idea of war-related trauma, even if indirectly. The fact that the dreams in question are revealed to be taking place the day before the bombing of Pearl Harbor also intensify this focus on war and its troubling psychological consequences. The story's central horror idea of being trapped in a war situation where you know the most terrible things are about to happen and you can't stop them, and reliving that situation over and over, I think is one that would have resonated very deeply with many who saw this episode on its first airing and subsequently. The story's device does feel like a kind of analogue of PTSD and reliving trauma over and over, being haunted by it. It's interesting to keep in mind that Rod Serling himself returned from his war service suffering terrible nightmares and flashbacks, things we would now recognise as symptoms of PTSD, and he did state that he turned to writing to get these things off his chest. Contrast this with the young sailor who hasn't seen active service in the story and how he seems so happy, so carefree and optimistic. The idea of being able to go back in time to warn your younger self and your friends about the coming horrors of war must have been something many wished they could do. If we were to take away the supernatural aspect of this, the time travel element that the title suggests, it is essentially a story about a man trapped in a traumatic war moment in the past and his anguished hope that he can salvage this moment and save people he knows will be killed or psychologically damaged. This teleplay seems to be going for some moments of broad comedy in a way which I think would have been handled differently in the Twilight Zone series. That said, there are some great lines in this one, notably where the protagonist says to the barman, "I want a dry martini. I want it so dry the olive will come up coughing." But once we get into the marrow of the story, the drama really intensifies in a very compelling way. The startling character of Rod Serling's ideas takes center stage, and it's very much a story about an older man trying to reach back to save the innocence of young soldiers from the kind of trauma he is already scarred by himself. Jenson seems genuinely haunted by the youth and innocence of the young sailor and his new bride, and the spectre of Jenson, older, psychologically troubled and haggard in the midst of the carefree pre-Pearl Harbor bar crowd, is very confronting, like a ghost of Christmas future at the party. It's a powerful and poignant story because we all know the past and we wish we could change parts of it. The shot of the attacking Japanese planes looming closer is a very powerful moment, and the special effect or process shot of the planes is really beautifully executed and chilling. The other special effect of the dream being superimposed on Jenson's forehead I felt was not quite as well handled. The brilliant setup of this episode is that it takes place in a psychiatrist's session. We are running against the clock as it counts down, just as Jenson is fighting against time in his dream or time travel experience. I also love the way that Jenson and the psychiatrist change places, physically and in other ways, as the doctor grows increasingly unsure that Jenson's dream is just a fantasy. The ending of this is devastating. No spoilers, but it is so powerful. The doctor doubts his own sanity and is forced to question what he understands about reality, and he is haunted by the inadequacy of his own response to Jenson. Or is he being haunted by his own PTSD? Desi's outro giving his take on what happened, then playing for comedy, unfortunately does undercut the dramatic 1-2 punch of this story's conclusion and makes you realise why Rod Serling might have been so keen to find a situation in which he could exercise greater creative control over his scripts and the framework in which they were presented. The episode ends with Desi walking into a prolonged infomercial for Westinghouse fridges. No judgment here. This is how TV was back then, and Westinghouse were the sponsors of the show. It is a bit jarring, though, to a modern viewer, just as Rod Serling's cigarette endorsements at the end of some Twilight Zone episodes might also sit a bit uneasily with some viewers today. But TV was made for selling advertising. Streaming services aside, that is still the way it works. Now we just have more separation between the program and the ads. Nice to see Lucille Ball at the end, though, looking very glamorous, promoting a Lucy crossover show with the Danny Thomas show. The cast. If you think the cast of this program all seem very familiar in a Twilight Zone context, you are not imagining things. Many of them appeared in multiple episodes. William Bendix did not, but he is a familiar face and a memorable presence in countless movies. The different emotional levels he brings to this role are impressive. He really sells the premise and the anguish of a man who is doubting reality. Martin Balsam gives a sensitive and nuanced performance as the Doctor. Now, you might recognize or be familiar with him from Psycho and countless other film roles. He would also go on to feature in 2 Twilight Zone episodes. Sci-fi fans might also know that Martin Balsam was one of the people supposed to voice Hal in 2001 before being replaced. Jesse White as the barman would also appear in 2 Twilight Zone episodes. Now, I love Jesse White. He is always great, and I particularly love his performances in Harvey and The Bad Seed, but he pops up everywhere and he always adds value to any movie. He's just one of those great character actors who is always a joy to watch. Carol Kearney, who plays the young bride, will also appear in the Twilight Zone. Don Kiefer, who plays Hannafy, would appear in 3 Twilight Zones. Even this episode's director, Alan Reisner, would go on to direct a Twilight Zone episode. The cast are sensational, but the real breakout star here is Serling's imagination. If an imagination could be said to have star power, it shines here as arrestingly as any actor. Ultimately, it is Serling's script, his imagination, and razor-sharp dialogue that steals this show even from this amazing cast of actors. The sense we are left with in watching this is that Rod Serling is here. He has arrived and he is ready to give us something very special. Thankfully, this was also recognised by network executives who gave the green light for the Twilight Zone to make its debut in 1959. If you have any thoughts on the time element, please leave a comment down below. Next time, we take our first steps into the Twilight Zone proper with Season 1, Episode 1, Where Is Everybody? Please like and subscribe for more Twilight Zone reviews and other weird film fun. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.